from? Where did you grow up?
I grew up all over. My dad was in HR, and we moved every couple of years. So I'm currently in Rochester, New York. I've lived there longer than I've lived anywhere else, and I didn't move there until after college. Other than that, I started in Santa Cruz, California, and went something like 19 states. So it was crazy.
So if you were to take some of what you've talked about and now transfer it to the community level and think about these different places you've lived and all of the different communities and the types of people that are there and how the demographics are different from one city to another, one community to another.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about anything that comes to mind in terms of bringing some of the value of what we're learning in serious games and in game development and in play and in simulation into the community and helping community members come together and co-create community.
Sure. So, I mean, obviously many of the places I lived are culturally different from one another. I lived in the South, I lived in the West, I lived in the Northeast, and anybody that's bounced around those communities knows it can be a challenge to go from one to the next, mm-hmm. particularly in grade school. When I think about there, but at the same time there are also certain just sort of shared commonalities that we have as human beings, and human beings that live near one another, and human beings that share a town, share a neighborhood, share a community, right? There are all those sorts of problems that don't go away, but they might get addressed differently depending on where you are and what the culture is and those kinds of things. So, I look at things where, games have this ability because they're social, to get us to interact with one another in a situation or a context that has very little risk of true failure, and that's exciting. And so I think, what I would want to do is I would want to say, well, what are the current problems of the community? What's everybody talking about in that community? Or is the problem they're not talking as a community? And start to identify some low-hanging fruit of saying, okay, well, let's get everybody involved in a discussion about X in a very whimsical, very playful kind of way. And that, I think, that can be done again and again. And it goes back to a little bit about that community manager role or that community facilitator role. But, increasingly technology and interactivity have a part in that dialogue.
I know one of the keys that I've seen in complaints with people that are trying to encourage community participation mm-hmm. from the members of the community is how to get them to show up, how to get them to engage.
Right.
And so games and play is a great way, mm-hmm. I think. Any suggestions if you were to sit down at the table or on the phone with one of these people that's really wanting to do something? How can I get my community members to show up? What might the headline be?
Mm-hmm. One thing is there a shared, either a shared issue, a shared problem, a shared love of something, a shared just is there something within that community that everyone cares about, right? And use that as the beginnings of a platform, right? So like I know in my community right now, we now have a Facebook group for our neighborhood, which is a little strange, because usually Facebook is like who you're friends with, but we have one for our neighborhood specifically because we wanted to talk about the homeowners association. And the reason that we did that was we weren't particularly happy with the homeowners association because they weren't doing very much as a homeowners association. So we wanted to kind of have a dialogue about that. Well, how could we have a dialogue? So, first we went door to door, right? And that never works because nobody wants to answer their door. And a lot of times people aren't home and they're not, And so what we basically figured out was everyone in the neighborhood was actually fairly passionate about knowing when the neighborhood was going to get finished, right? Because this is something that affects their property values and so da 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 da. And so what we did is we organized a dialogue with the builder company on the on the Facebook group. But in order to be a part of the dialogue, you had to sign up to the Facebook group, right? Well, of course, everybody wants to sign up just so they can lurk and figure out what the builder's going to say about when this is done. But it was identifying that shared space, right? That shared need for communication on this one particular issue, right? And use that as a tool to do something else, right? Rather than just stick a note on everyone's mailbox and say, here's what the builder said, because then you have no second, you've brought them together, but you haven't actually given them a reason to continue to participate. So that's the kind of thinking that I would try to use to come at that.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. And just to end with, I'm going to give you a choice.
Okay.
You can either tell me a funny story,
Mm-hmm.
or something more serious, which is tell me something that you've experienced that changed your life.
Okay. I'll go with change my life, and people can decide if they think it's funny or not.
Okay.
So the thing that I look back on that changed my life was the game Bard's Tale, which was an Interplay Productions EA early RPG on the Commodore 64 at the time. And I played that like no tomorrow, and I had little pieces of graph paper where we wrote down all the maps and all this kind of stuff.
And you were how old?
And I was, I want to say in like second grade, maybe third, somewhere around there. And it was the first game that I played that felt like a story, and it felt like a world. It wasn't bounded by a screen. It wasn't a Space Invaders. It wasn't a Pac-Man. It wasn't an arcade game, right? It was the first game that I can remember. I'm sure there were precursors, but it's the first one that I really remember playing that that I felt like I was exploring it. And it was also the first game that I played with my dad. And that's when games had me and never really let me go.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Been fun.